In this Eco-West presentation, we discuss land ownership patterns in the West. The preponderance of public land is one of the West's defining features. This graphic shows that nearly half of the 11 western states are owned by the federal government. The biggest landowner in the West is the Bureau of Land Management, followed by the Forest Service. Outside of the West and Alaska, there is very little federal land in other states. This graphic shows how land use and land type differ according to the owner. Virtually all cropland, for instance, is privately owned. Public land, whether owned by the federal, state, or other form of government, tends to have a mix of land types. Federal lands in the West include undeveloped parks and wilderness areas, rangeland grazed by livestock, national forests that may or may not be logged, and a variety of other land uses. This map shows what percentage of each state is owned by the federal government. Trust lands, mostly Indian reservations, are not included. Nevada and Alaska top the list, and all western states have at least 30% of their land under federal control. Back east, New Hampshire, Vermont, and of course the District of Columbia have the most federal land. Here we see all of the states that have at least 10% of land owned by the federal government. Western states are at the top, but it's worth noting that the rate of federal ownership varies from around 30% in Montana and Washington to nearly 85% in Nevada. Let's take a closer look at the mosaic of land ownership and land uses in the West and elsewhere. The black on this map shows urbanized areas. You can see that there are far more big cities back east, but the West certainly has its share, especially along and near the Pacific coast. In the eastern half of the country, the bulk of the land is unprotected and privately owned. There's also plenty of that in the West in places like the Central Valley in California, southeast Washington, and eastern Montana. But especially in the inland West, much of the land is either federal, state, or tribal. Let's start filling in more landowners, beginning with a couple of minor players, such as parcels that have a variety of owners, depicted here in pink. There are also some private lands dedicated to conservation, seen here in yellow. They're typically smaller parcels and scattered, so they don't show up well on a national map, but these lands are critical to conservation, and we return to them in our discussion of land trusts. Orange represents local or regional land agencies, such as those run by cities or counties. Now let's start talking about some of the major players. Especially in the West, but also in some parts of the upper Midwest and Northeast, a fair amount of land is controlled by state governments. Out west, these acres were generally given to the states by the federal government when territories entered the Union, and typically states are supposed to raise money for their public schools by selling some of these lands to the highest bidder. But the parcels tend to be scattered and intermixed with federal lands. Tribal land covers large parts of Arizona and New Mexico, and it's found in every western state. But the biggest player is clearly the federal government. Within all of that green, there are many different agencies in charge of how the land is managed, and each has its own mission and mandate. Let's take a closer look at how federal land breaks down. Military training and weapons experiments take place on lands controlled by the Departments of Defense and Energy. Some of these places, such as the fabled Area 51 in southern Nevada, are top secret, but portions of others, such as the Barry M. Goldwater bombing range in southwest Arizona, are open to recreational users who get a special permit. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, part of the Interior Department, manages some very sizable national wildlife refuges, often to benefit endangered species and waterfowl. Our national parks protect some of the nation's most spectacular scenery and ecosystems. Many of the mountainous areas of the West are under the purview of the Forest Service, although there are also some national forests back east. But the biggest federal landowner is the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, which controls many of the lower elevation federal lands that lie in the basins between the mountains. Because there's so much public property in the West, many landscapes are at least nominally protected by the government. This map shows that the region does quite well in this measure, even on a global scale. But public ownership doesn't equal immunity from human influence. The vast network of roads and other infrastructure in the region has fragmented habitat and abetted the spread of non-native species. The multiple-use philosophy that governs much of the property overseen by the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management means that natural resources are often vulnerable to development and human activity. Thanks for watching this presentation. You can download it and other libraries at ecowest.org.